Welcome to the Criminal Imagination. This series, Crime and Civilization, begins with a simple question. What if the true purpose of law is not justice but control? Across centuries, crime fiction has recorded the political fears of its age, from cursed kings and cunning thieves to corrupt judges and silent witnesses. Each episode investigates how power operates through narrative, what it hides, who it condemns, and what happens when the system turns inwards and begins to devour itself. Today, we journey into one of Edgar Allan Poe's most baffling and underappreciated stories, The Mystery of Mary Rogêt. You may know Poe as the master of Gothic horror, the dark interiors, the crumbling minds, the ominous birds. But today's case is different. The Mystery of Mary Rogêt is a true crime retelling, the first of its kind in modern fiction, based directly on the real-life murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers in 1841 New York. Poe relocates the tragedy to Paris and presents it as a cold deductive puzzle. But behind the mask of ratiocination, sometimes something darker lurks. This episode is not about whether Dupin gets it right. It's about why women like Mary or Mary get written out of their own stories. Because this is a case study in political erasure. It is about how women disappear inside statistics. It's about how media manufactures noise and names it justice. And it is about how crime fiction, even in its infancy, already knew the modern state is obsessed with the disappearance of the individual, especially if she is a woman. In 1841, the body of a young woman, Mary Rogers, was found floating in the Hudson River. She had gone missing days earlier, last seen leaving her mother's boarding house in Manhattan. Her death sparked a frenzy. Newspapers speculated wildly. Clergymen sermonized, Protestants blamed Catholics, politicians blamed vice, and the New York police, still in their infancy, bungled the case spectacularly. Enter Edgar Allan Poe. At the time, Poe had just introduced C. Auguste Dupin in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely regarded as the first detective story in Western literature. But while that tale was pure fiction, The Mystery of Mary Rogêt was something new, a forensic novel based on a real murder that had not yet been resolved. Poe changed the name from Mary Rogers to Mary Rogêt, moved the city from New York to Paris, but the rest, the timing, the disappearance, the river, the press panic, was left uncannily intact. And here is the twist. Poe's story ends with no resolution. He never wrote a final part. Murray disappears. The investigation spirals into overanalysis, and we are left deliberately without closure. It is easy to read this as an unfinished manuscript, but what if that incompleteness is the point? What if Poe is telling us that in modern society, some lives are never meant to be resolved, only studied, hypothesized, and forgotten? This is not failure, that's a system. Let's step back. Mary Rogers, like her fictional counterpart Murray, was a working class woman. In real life, she was known as the beautiful cigar girl, working the counter at New York tobacco shop. Her presence alone drew male clientele. She became a media sensation. But with fame came danger. After her death, the public narrative split into two grotesque possibilities. First, the moral tale, which said Mary was a fallen woman meeting the fate of vice and seduction. The second was the romantic tragedy. Mary was a pure soul corrupted by the evils of society. Either way, her personhood vanished. What remained was a symbol, an object, a cautionary tale. Poe's Mary Roche is deeply aware of this process. But rather than rescue her from it, Poe reflects it precisely by drowning her in the layers of abstract reasoning. Here's where the genius and horror of the text lies. In the story, Dupin receives newspaper clippings about Mary's death. He doesn't investigate the crime scene, he doesn't speak to witnesses, he studies data. He performs a rational armchair autopsy based on press reports and statistical probability. We are told again and again how reasonable this is. Dupin critiques the reckless conjectures of the press. He builds a case on logic and deduction. But behind the veneer of reason lies something chilling. Marie's actual life, her fears, her voice, her final hours are never known. They are overwritten by numbers. She becomes a symptom, a calculation, a dead body that exists only to prove a method. And that's the point. Poe is not just telling a mystery, he's staging an allegory of how modern institutions, press, police, readers, even writers consume female death, not to mourn it, but to solve it, to explain it, to use it. And in doing so, they erase her. To understand Mary Roche, we need to understand the media landscape of Poe's time. In the early 1800s, America was undergoing a transformation. The rise of cheap newspapers, so-called penny papers, meant that sensational stories could reach vast audiences. For the first time, crime was national entertainment. Mary Rogers' death became the prototype of the media spectacle, and Poe, ever the observer, saw its dangers. In Mary Roche, the Parisian newspapers do not reveal the truth. They manufacture confusion. One paper speculates about a gang of ruffians, another suggests suicide, another bizarrely blames atmospheric pressure. Each article contradicts the last, and Dupin, while critiquing them, engages in a similar process. He dissects speculation to build more speculation. We don't get truth, we get the simulation of method. In a way, the mystery of Mary Roche is less about a murder and more about epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do we know if it's true? This becomes a haunting metaphor for modernity. Because as the modern state grows, so does the media apparatus that feeds it. Surveillance, journalism, policing, science all claim to reveal the truth. But in cases like Marie's, what they often do is displace it. They convert lives into narratives, and when the story doesn't fit, they adjust the facts or simply move on. At the heart of Poe's tale is C. Auguste Dupin, the forerunner to Holmes, Poirot, and every eccentric detective since. He is rational, brilliant, cold. He treats crime as a riddle, a game, a demonstration of superior intellect. And that's the problem. Dupin is so detached from the actual personhood of Marie that he becomes the emblem of modern bureaucracy. Like the state itself, he does not feel the crime, he models it. In one key moment, Dupin dismisses public outrage, saying, "The populace invariably confound the unusual with the abstruse." In other words, don't trust feeling, trust reason. But what if reason, stripped of empathy, is another form of violence? Dupin never once considers Marie's inner world. He doesn't ask why a woman might feel unsafe. He doesn't ask about patriarchy, vulnerability, trauma. He asks what is most probable, and in doing so, he reveals the gendered cruelty of statistical logic. This is what we might call the epistemic violence of the modern state, the ability to categorize and explain suffering without ever confronting it. And it is not accidental, it is institutional. The mystery of Mary Roget is an early case study in a pattern that would repeat across centuries. When women suffer violence, their bodies are taken up as data points, used to justify moral panics, media frenzies, and state reforms. But the women themselves are erased. You see this in the Whitechapel murders, in the sensational trials of the 20th century, in contemporary coverage of missing women, especially women of color. Crime fiction becomes the mirror to this phenomenon, but also sometimes its co-conspirator. Even when well-intentioned, many crime narratives reduce women to victims, clues, motivation for male protagonists. Poe's story reflects this too, but he also exposes it. Mary's mystery is unsolved, not because Poe couldn't write an ending, but because no ending could undo the systematic erasure that caused her death in the first place. Let's return to the real case. Mary Rogers's murder was never solved. Multiple theories emerged: gang violence, botched abortion, domestic dispute, but no one was charged. The NYPD, then just a few years old, struggled with jurisdiction, public pressure, and media distortion. This failure wasn't incidental, it was structural. The modern police force was designed less to solve crime than to manage the perception of disorder. As Michael Foucault might say, it is a disciplinary apparatus, not a mechanism of justice. Poe saw this. That's why Mary Roget is awash in method but empty of meaning. Dupin performs the illusion of control. He offers logic, certainty, process, but the crime remains. The mystery in the end is not just who killed Mary, it is what kind of society produces her death and forgets it so easily. In one of the story's most infamous sections, Dupin presents a statistical argument about floating bodies, specifically how long a corpse typically remains underwater before resurfacing. He concludes that since Mary's body surfaced earlier than expected, something is amiss. This moment has fascinated and disturbed critics, because here we see the full mechanization of the human body. Mary is no longer a person. She is a case file, a set of variables, a statistical anomaly. This is where the modern state's obsession with data becomes terrifying. Numbers create a veneer of objectivity, but they also enable a form of abstraction that removes accountability. When we explain death through averages, we forget the life. This is why Mary Roget feels so modern, because today logic governs everything: predictive policing, forensic profiling, public health statistics, actuarial risk, and within that logic, some bodies, especially female, poor, racialized, become less visible, less real. They vanish not into rivers but into spreadsheets. In classical tragedy, the end is catharsis. In medieval justice, punishment is spectacle. But in modern crime fiction, something changes. In Mary Roget, there is no punishment, no confession, no closure. There is only analysis. This reflects the world Poe saw emerging around him, a world where institutions grow powerful not by solving problems, but by studying them endlessly. This is the paradox of the modern state. It collects more data than ever. It enacts more procedures than ever. It creates more experts than ever. And yet, some crimes remain immune, not because they are obscure, but because they are inconvenient to solve. Mary Rogers was inconvenient, too famous, too ambiguous, too exposed. And so, her case was consumed by the very structures that claim to investigate it. Poe understood this. That's why he left Mary Roget unresolved, because some disappearances are the point, not a failure of the system, but its very mechanism. Let's return one last time to the core image. A woman's body floating in a river, hundreds of pages are written about her, thousands of theories, and yet she is not here. Her thoughts, her terror, her life erased. The mystery of Mary Roget is a work of crime fiction, but it is also a philosophical autopsy of the modern world. It asks, what happens to women when the media turns them into symbols? What happens to justice when it is replaced by procedure? What happens to knowledge when it values statistics over testimony? And finally, what happens to us as a society when our greatest crime stories are not about restoring order, but about explaining away its absence? Mary Roche's death was never solved, but maybe, just maybe, her story was never meant to be a puzzle at all. It was a mirror, and we are meant to look. If this episode helped you see crime fiction and modern society in a new light, subscribe and stay tuned for our next case file. Until next time, remember, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones we live inside. Stay sharp.